Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over the last two series, we've been talking to human rights academics and practitioners about research, impact, and advocacy in the area of human rights. In this series, we turn our attention to the struggle to end modern slavery. I'm Todd. In today's episode of the Rights Track, we are discussing slavery and statistics. My guest today is Professor Sir Bernard Silverman, Professor of Modern Slavery Statistics at the University of Nottingham. Before joining Nottingham, Professor Silverman was the Chief Scientific Officer at the Home Office and produced the first estimate of the number of modern slaves in the United Kingdom. A graduate of mathematics and statistics at the University of Cambridge, he has held senior academic and leadership posts at the universities of Bath, Bristol, and Oxford. He is Fellow of the Royal Society and of the Academy of Social Sciences, and former President of the Royal Statistical Society. So welcome to this episode of the Rights Track, Bernard. It's really great to have you here with us.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So you're a mathematician, a statistician, you had an illustrious academic career, you worked for government, worked for the Home Office, you were the Chief Scientific Officer, and you've just recently worked on a whole project about estimating the prevalence of modern slavery in the United Kingdom. So my first question really is, this is one of these hard to find populations, and it's a typical problem of statistics, and one might even say a fundamental problem of unobservability. There's practices out there in the world that we just simply can't see. So it's akin to things like torture, it's akin to things like arbitrary detention, exile, disappearance, those sorts of things. So as a mathematician, as a statistician, where do you start studying a problem that's as complex as this?
Right. Well, the first thing is you don't give up. So there's a sense in which statistics was always about measuring things that were seen to be hard to measure. So the idea of having a census was about measuring the whole of the population, which was not actually considered to be easy. I can go back further than that. If you go back to the Doomsday Book in the 11th century, they had the idea of surveying all the economic activity of the country. And again, it was hard to reach. So the idea of trying to measure a hard-to-reach population isn't new by any means.
But it's founded on this idea that you're making inferences based on a sample of information. And, we wring our hands and we spend shed loads of textbooks and libraries full of methods for getting the least biased sample possible from which we make the strongest, most certain inferences. And even then, those inferences come with a margin of error.
Absolutely. And there are two different margins of error. So the only way you can ever do this is by constructing some kind of mathematical model to describe the data that you have actually seen. And classical sample inference is very simple. You want to know what percentage of people are going to vote Conservative in an election. You go out, you do opinion polls, and then you can extrapolate from that to the whole of the population.
And the opinion poll is based on a sample where every person in that sample had an equal chance of being selected.
Maybe, and if you're cleverer, you construct the sample in a cleverer way. But of course, even then, you still have to figure out whether they're actually going to vote. And so one of the issues around opinion polls, before I move on to the actual question, is that people's propensity to vote is not easily determined. And it's suggested that one of the reasons that pollsters have not been very good, one of the reasons they didn't predict Mr. Trump's election and so on, is simply that they didn't really understand who was going to vote and who was not going to vote. So it's difficult even then. So if we now move back to this particular problem, it's not so simple. You can't just use classical sampling theory to say each person has an equal chance of being selected. Ordinary crimes, you can go out and you can select, you can do a sample of population, you can say, were you pickpocketed last year?
Right.
And it's sufficient numbers of people pickpocketed that you'll get enough people to get an answer. Here, you can't find the victims, you can't easily ask them, you have every possible difficulty as to why the standard methodology doesn't work.
So technically, the people that do come forward would be described as a convenience sample. Is that correct?
That's a good word to use, yes.
So it's by convenience that we know them. And that's, in the UK context, through police reporting, through the national crime agencies, through the national referral mechanism, and a number of other sources that all are either correctly identifying or not correctly identifying people involved in modern slavery.
That's right. So if you go back to another human rights, similar work has been done on estimating how many deaths there were in the military in Kosovo. And then it was even harder because you had to find lists of people that had died and then figure out how many people weren't on any lists. And what goes on here is the same thing, that you've got lists of potential victims, of people you think are victims, and you've got so and so many people are reported by the police, and so many by local authorities, and so on and so on. And then you have to build up from that a picture of the total number, including those that you didn't know about.
So one of the possible criticisms of translating the work that was done in Kosovo and other places, so there was work done on truth commissions in East Timor and Sierra Leone, South Africa, Peru, etc. But one of the criticisms is that the mandate for counting in all of those examples was effectively the dead body, right? So it was about deaths, it was about political killings, it was about something that's quite easy to count. Whereas the definition of slavery, whether we use the Bellagio-Harvard guidelines, whether we use any other definition, might be construed as broader. And there's a worry that if it's broader, you're counting apples and oranges and calling them all pears. Have you worried about that particular problem?
Not explicitly, but curiously, what you say actually has an obverse, which is that what you've said is that there is no such thing as the number of victims of modern slavery. Because if you're dead, you're dead. Now, of course, it's true, you could have died. If you're dead, the margin of error is, did you die of natural causes, or would you have died anyway?
Yes.
So we think about excess deaths. So we think about, old people, young people die anyway. But in this case, because it's to some extent a grey area whether someone is or isn't a victim, there is a sense in which whatever estimate you have, what you're saying is if it's a plausible estimate, that under some reasonable definition, this is the number. But we should understand that we're not estimating a fixed number. We're estimating a number which itself, even if you could actually get hold of every possible victim and interview them and determine their status, you would still have uncertainty about the total number. Because in some cases it would be obvious that they were victims, in other cases it would be obvious that they were not, and in some cases the question of whether they were a victim of slavery as opposed to someone who just had a very hard life for some other reason might be essentially undecidable. It might be arbitrary.
I think that's a really great distinction. And if we went back to the killing example, there were some critiques even of the killing style counting. I know Richard Wilson in the United States criticized some of the work being done on truth commissions, and he used the example of a village elder who's killed in a village in Guatemala, and he said there's probably 5 different stories about that killing. Yeah. Right? So it could be that he was corrupt and he was killed for his corruption. It could be so organized crime, whatever, got rid of him. Could be he was having an affair with a neighbor's wife and it was just a revenge killing. It could be that he was a political opposition leader and the dominant party didn't want him, or the military didn't want him in power, and they killed him. In each one of those cases, it could be a common murder. It could be an act of murder between an avenged party, or it could actually be a human rights violation.
So as a statistician, I counted as 1/5 or 1/10 or something like that.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is if you had 10 such scenarios, well, we reckon that on the average one of those would have been a political killing, or 5 of them, or whatever. Yeah. And so I don't have a problem about counting fractions. Yeah. Now, of course, in slavery you're not doing that. But what I am saying is that we must understand what is meant by a number of victims. It means that our best estimate, our best guess of the number is that number.
And how do we feel about the number in the UK? So it ranges between 10,000 and 13,000. Yeah. In your work looking at the world, let's say, because I know with the Modern Slavery Unit and also the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, there is a remit to look at sender countries and why the UK is receiving slaves, why we have slaves here, etc. Is this a big number? Is this a small number? How is this relative, compared to other slave populations in the world?
So the first thing I would say is that number depends on various mathematical assumptions. And the mathematical assumptions are quite openly available. You can read about them. And probably they're not quite accurate, because like all mathematical models, the statistician George Box said all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so the model is not quite right. It will not be exactly right. And the way in which it isn't right is likely to mean that the real number's more. So it's quite probably more. I don't think it's going to be astronomically more. It won't be 5 times as much, but there are probably victims who are really the unknown unknowns,
Yes.
and those we wouldn't count this way. Well, first of all, is it a large number? Yes, of course it's a large number. 10,000 people is a lot of people, and so even if there's only 10,000, and the national referral mechanism now has a few thousand, maybe not as many as 10,000. That's a lot of people, and it's not acceptable that there should be any number of victims in our country. And if there's this many, then we really have something to worry about, which those people that work in the field always knew. But what this figure has done is to bring it all to public consciousness. So it concentrated in the minds of politicians, the police, and the general public on the fact that this is not just a trivial thing that happens to a small number of people. This is a lot of victims, and we need to do something about it. And then if you look worldwide, work that the Walk Free Foundation did some years ago suggested that if you look at the risk factors, if you look at the things that are likely to predispose towards them, we're probably at the bottom end. So in other words, whatever it's like here, it'll be worse everywhere else.
Yeah, it's interesting when you read the work of Walk Free, because they have figures that there's 18 million slaves in India, for example. Relative to the population, it's quite a small number, but the absolute number is big.
That's right.
And you go to Luxembourg and there are 100. Now, I find 100 sort of implausible, right?
Well,
and then I think about Luxembourg, and I think, well, Luxembourg's one of these countries that probably doubles its population during the day because people commute in to work there and then they disappear.
So some of those people will themselves be slaves.
Yes. So that 100 might be a fungible number.
So basically, the 100 is a back-constructed figure. So what it's saying is that if you think the prevalence in Luxembourg per head of population is similar to that in Belgium, then get an estimate for Belgium and use the same estimate for Luxembourg. So it doesn't actually tell you anything about Luxembourg specifically. What it's telling you is that Luxembourg is a bit like other places around it. And, by the way, it's got X number of population. And you've actually just pointed out why. And I remember reading statistics about how many people went abroad on holiday. And from the United States, most people don't go abroad on holiday.
Yeah.
From Luxembourg, 98% of the population go abroad on holiday.
Right. Yeah.
So I think, So I think that, what you're doing is you're saying what our country's like. And I think that our new legislative framework makes this country even less friendly towards modern slavery than it was before. And therefore, while it's very hard to measure prevalence year on year, what I think must happen is that the less friendly we become towards this offence, the more other places will be worse, sadly.
So in Whitehall, there's obviously discussions about budget allocation, and it sounds really boring, but clearly as a government minister, you have to decide where you're going to put precious resource. So compared to other organised criminal activity and other crime statistics, where does modern slavery fit, as it were, in the hierarchy of priorities? So Theresa May was very much involved with the Modern Slavery Act when she was Home Secretary and is now Prime Minister. She's still very keen on the issue. How does it compare relative to knife crime, other organised crime, sexual assault, all these sorts of statistics?
I don't think that central government actually decides allocations between different areas of police activity, for example. That's up to police forces. What I do know is that this continues to be one of Theresa May's concerns. There's a task force on modern slavery, which she still chairs, and she does. She chairs it very actively. And the effect of that sort of thing is to exercise soft power on the way that the police force and other agencies work. If you're a police officer and you know that the National Police Lead is going to have to go to a meeting chaired by the Prime Minister and talk about what the police are doing to combat modern slavery, that means that resources will be put in that direction.
Okay. So that's a better way of answering the question, because it's about
I didn't answer the question.
But you did. It's about agenda setting, right? And so it's not about budget allocation, it's about agenda setting.
And I think all that the government can do ultimately is to set agendas, because fighting this crime is the job of all of us. And I think that the profile this has means that if you went to a car wash and you thought your car was being washed by someone who was not there of their own accord, or were aware in your everyday life of some incidents of modern slavery, you would be inclined to look up a helpline or to ring 112 or whatever. And then if the police got a report of it, they would be inclined to do something about it. So the whole thing becomes a kind of virtuous circle once the agenda's been set.
Yeah, so it's a combination or an interaction between awareness raising, agenda setting, and also the non-governmental sector picking up the issue and working with the academic sector, etc. So I wonder if we might just move the conversation along a little bit. So there's the estimation of the sort of prevalence issue. It's a hard to find population. There are assumptions in the mathematical model. There you could run many different models and average the results. And there's probably a whole textbook on how this might be done. But then there's also sort of measures that we might call proxy measures, things that we think are good surrounding indicators, peripheral indicators where we might think the prevalence of slavery is likely to be higher because these other things are also higher. So what are the sorts of these other things that might be higher in an area that would be have a higher probability of slavery prevalence?
For example, people suspect bank accounts or very, very cheap, the ability of you to access services at prices which mean that there must be something wrong.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you can have your car washed for £4, it may be that the people doing it are happy to work for £1 an hour. There are people, I mean,
even though that's illegal.
It's illegal,
yeah.
but it's not modern slavery unless the person is actually unable to walk away from it.
Yeah, that's right.
So it may be that there are people who actually are happy to work for very, very low wages, and that's a different problem. I think also people popping up in different places you wouldn't expect to. So if you saw someone offering some service and then you discover that the same person was offering the same service somewhere else, then you might ask, well, why is it that you've got the same person offering something in two different places? Are they being trafficked from one place to the other, or is it that they are operating some kind of peripatetic business? So
there's the peripatetic business, and then there's also the parallel business. So it's all entirely possible that a car wash where it's really cheap to get your car washed, so it's £6 for 6 people to wash your car in half an hour. Obviously that doesn't pay those people a proper wage, but you have a captive audience of a car coming into a car wash that might want to buy some drugs while they're there, right? So you can have a parallel activity, right? But that's entirely plausible, and therefore there's an intersectionality, if you will, in the criminal activity.
But I think that proxy measures would involve things like suspicious financial transactions, suspicious patterns of personal behaviour, and so on. I mean, I think that we're only in getting reliable proxy measures, we're only in the infancy of doing that.
Yeah.
But that's, and we must understand we're measuring the proxy measure. Mapping directly from a proxy measure to a number is not easy. And it may well be, and this is another statistical point, it may be easier to spot changes and differences than absolute levels. So it may be that we could say, this is a proxy measure for the amount of modern slavery, and over the next 5 years our aim is to reduce that proxy measure by 50%. We may not know exactly what effect that has on modern slavery, but if it's a decent proxy measure, it will at least have made a difference.
Yeah, and finally, what about big data analytical techniques? So I've read a lot about people that work in counterterrorism, anti-criminal networks, etc., where they might use techniques of web scraping and sentiment analysis and other things where there's publicly available data that's been put in the public domain for completely different reasons that can be harvested and marshaled to create sort of clouds of meaning. Even corpus linguistic analysis of large swaths of text might pick up. It's like the chat. I'm thinking of intelligence agencies picking up chatter. So is there a way we can use big data techniques to get at some of this proxy data question around prevalence or hotspots?
Well, one thing we could do for start is using this sort of technique to look at the policy statements that companies are supposed to make about supply chains.
Yeah.
And so an interesting thing to do would be and that would be quite simple, but even that's not that simple, would be to web scrape those and do textual analysis on those. Doing larger textual analysis is going to be more difficult because you're going to, if you're worried about slavery in a particular sector, a particular typology of slavery, then you'd have to find a way of focusing down on that sector and see what people are saying about it. And one of the problems you have here is that there is no clear control group, so you can't. You'd have to have an idea ahead of time what you were looking for.
Yeah.
So you can't say I'm going to look at all companies offering block paving and see which of them have things on their websites that are a bit suspicious.
So this has been a fascinating journey through the sort of statistics of a hard to find population. And, the insight really is it's about using information about the world that we know to say something about information about the world that we don't know.
Absolutely.
And it's been a fascinating discussion with you in a very important topic area. And I just wanted to thank you on behalf of the Rights Track for joining us on this episode.
Thank you.
This episode of The Rights Track was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Christine Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 3 of our podcast is funded by the Rights Lab, a University of Nottingham programme of research which is working to end modern slavery. You can find out more in our episode show notes, and please subscribe to the podcast for future episodes as we find out more about the research helping to achieve that aim.